I title this Monkey Business on purpose, right? It's not just a joke. It's actually really important for us to realize that the lives of these macaques, their business, the way they conduct themselves from day to day is always integrated in our world, right? We humans are driving what their world looks like. So monkey business is always about the complex nature of the humans and how they interpret, shape, and structure the way the macaques live. So let me just frame this whole thing. It turns out, and Benjamin Lee already said this, that human-monkey overlaps are widespread. That is, across much of the planet, there are humans and other primates, frequently macaques, and this complexity of coexistence has conflict. It has exchange of pathogens, viruses, different bacteria go back and forth. It has impacts on the structure of the populations of the monkeys particularly, but also a little bit about us and how we live our lives. And one of the most important things is that we, and you in Singapore are doing this incredibly well, have to think about the role of management in this entire process, because we live and shape the world of so many species. Therefore, it is the moral and ethical obligation of humans to think about management. So I want to run through just a series of pictures here to show you how, and many of you have seen this in Singapore and maybe some other places, but how diverse and how amazing the overlap is between macaque monkeys and humans. These two pictures that I've just shown you are from Bali. Here's a picture of a rhesus macaque and a young man in northern India. Here we have southern India, a rhesus macaque who is a performing macaque along with her human. Here's Hong. Oh, I think someone has their speaker on. If you could just turn that off, thank you. Here we have Hong Kong, which is again one of these examples like Singapore, where we frequently forget, or many people forget that the monkeys live amongst some of the densest human populations on the planet. Here you see multiple places in Japan of humans and macaques coexisting. Throughout Thailand, this is a village in Thailand where we see humans and macaques living together. Bali again, Bali, humans, monkeys, dogs, bats, lizards. And this is Gibraltar, the one European place where we see macaque monkeys and humans interacting much in the same ways that we see them in other places around. So you live in Singapore, and this site might not be unfamiliar to all of you, and it is epitomizing the sort of complexity of these relationships between monkeys and humans. And everywhere you look in Singapore, particularly around the nature reserves, but really in many other places, the monkeys are always in your rearview mirror because you share a space. Monkeys and humans and many other animals share this incredible dynamic urban, forested, tropical ecosystem. And I want to come back to this at the very end again to point out that you live in one of the most unique urban environments on the planet, where you have a dynamic tropical forested ecosystem in and as part of your city. So the point of showing you all these pictures is to highlight that human macaque overlap is actually increasing. More macaques live in and around human cities and villages and temples than do live in the forests. And that's important because we as humans have a bit of a responsibility to understand these relations, because the macaques are part of our societies. They're part of our urban landscapes. Let me just say a few words about the long-tail macaque. So I'm assuming, let's see, there are something like 30 plus individuals in this Zoom. My guess is that all of you have seen a long-tail macaque, and many of you see them around in a quite familiar context. But what many of you may not realize is that the long-tail macaque, which looks to be everywhere, for example, in Singapore or in Thailand or parts of Indonesia, the long-tail macaque has in fact just been reclassified as an endangered primate. The long-tail macaques populations, which once numbered in the millions across Southeast Asia, now number in the tens of thousands, and their population has decreased by at least 50% in the last 20 years. And we are predicting it's going to decrease by another 50% in the next 20 years. So we have undergone, because of human changes to habitats and lifestyles, a significant change in the distribution of this species, which is the second most widely distributed monkey on the planet. And what's really important about Singapore, again, which we'll come back to at the end, is that you have a robust, vibrant, healthy population of an endangered species that lives with you. And that's something to consider as we move forward, thinking about conflicts, thinking about coexistence, and thinking about sustainability for the future. Okay, so there are billions of people in Southeast Asia and tens of thousands of macaques, and they coexist. They coexist in three important ways. One, they coexist in what we call anthropogenic landscapes. That is, they live, the macaque monkeys live in spaces where you live, where all of us humans live, and they share, interestingly, food, right? They eat the plants around us, but they also eat the food that we eat. They eat our garbage, and they would love to come into our house and eat whatever we have sitting in the kitchen. That's a given, because the foods we grow are wonderful for the macaques because of what we could call shared ecologies. The macaque monkey's gut, their stomach, their gut, their digestive tract is almost identical to yours and mine. So what's good for us, what tastes good to us, what we enjoy to eat, they can eat and enjoy just as well. And so we have this overlap in physiologies, which is really important, not just about what we can eat, but also, really interestingly, our health systems, what we would call the immune system. So macaque monkeys and humans can share viruses, we can share bacterial pathogens, we can share all sorts of infections. Now, many people are very worried about what you could get from a macaque. But it turns out there are a few things, but it's much more important, particularly in a place like Singapore, what we can give to the macaque monkeys. And this is particularly in regards to a variety of diseases such as measles, influenza, and even the common cold. So the final area of overlap that I think is very important, and hopefully we can talk about this in the Q&A, is this notion of being human and being macaque. We think of ourselves as very different from monkeys, and yet we love to watch monkeys because they're so much like us. And it turns out that the reason we love to watch monkeys is that we're primates. You and I, humans, we're primates, and we see in the macaques a common shared kinship. They are our cousins, we are their cousins. And so we see this overlap. And so when we think about living with them and all of the conflicts, we have to remember that these conflicts, these problems that we have sometimes living with them are because we're living with family members. And everyone knows, while we really love those closest to us, our family members, we also fight most frequently with those closest to us. And that's true for macaque monkeys. Okay, so let me give you, that's just a big overview of macaques. Let me give you two examples, not in Singapore, of the relationships between human and macaque monkeys, just to give you an idea of what these dynamics look like. And then we're going to come to Singapore, and I'm going to say again and again, something you already know, that you live in a very unique, very wonderful, very hopeful place for understanding the relationship between humans and monkeys. And we'll come back and I'll explain why I think Singapore is so hopeful relative to some of these other places. So let's start in Bali, Indonesia. So this picture you have here is actually this Ibu, this older woman, is in part of south central Bali, southern Bali, actually near the coast. And she has a little warung, a little store that's just at the base of this big hill. Up on the top of this hill is a temple, a Balinese Hindu temple, and a forest. In that forest are two groups of macaque monkeys, about 78 individuals. And every day, those macaque monkeys come down from that forest and that temple, down the hill to a road, just where her warung is, where her little store, the toko, is. And they cross the road into the neighboring village that has fields of corn and fields of rice and a variety of other agricultural things. And they raid and harass those villagers and try to take food from them. But what I found fascinating years ago when I was watching this was that every day when these 78 monkeys come down, they come down the hill, they get to the road, they cross the road and go into the fields to feed. This one male who you can see here. He's about 6 in this picture, 6 years old. But from the time he was about 4 years old, this one male would stop while the rest of the group moves on, and he would move over to the little warung, to this little shop, where this woman would come out and sit down with him and offer him a little bit of food. So this woman, human, and this macaque would sit together day after day after day for years. And they formed a relationship. And here's one of the challenges that I'd like to put forward, is that humans and monkeys have been forming this kind of relationship for tens of thousands of years in Southeast Asia. It's nothing new. So it has been sustainable in some way for tens of thousands of years. And now here we're at a crisis. Now here we're at times of conflict and problems. And so we need to think to the past and to the contemporary moment, how does all this work? So let me jump into this example. In Bali, Indonesia, it's home to over 3 million humans and many, many thousands of macaques, probably about 14 to 20,000 macaques at the moment. The interaction between humans and macaques are extensive, but they vary across the island. This is one of the densest places on the planet, not as dense as you are in Singapore for humans, but very dense with this incredible dense rice agriculture, this manipulation of the landscape. What we know is that Bali has been shaped by humans to look like this. The yellow area is rice agriculture, the red is villages and cities, and the green is the forest. So what one might think about where the monkeys would be in Bali and how they would live is one might look at all this green forested area and say, well, that's where the monkeys are, and this yellow red area is where the people are. Well, it turns out if you do, as my colleagues and I have done for many years, colleagues from the Universitas Udayana in Denpasar and a number of international colleagues, if you go out and look and ask, where are the macaques, you find this. So each of these sites is a site where many, well, 1 to 5 or 6 groups of monkeys live. And let me just go back to here. Look at this area here, right? Take a picture here. Here's all of the forest. Here's all of the people and rice agriculture. And in fact, it turns out that where the people are, where the agriculture is, where the villages and cities are, is where the macaque monkeys are. They're not in the forest. And that's true across all of Southeast Asia. Humans and macaque monkeys have lived together for tens of thousands of years, and that continues today. Singapore is nothing new. It is a typical pattern. Now, what is very interesting about the macaques in Bali, and many of you maybe have gone to Bali, to Ubud, Alaska Datan, Uluwatu, different sites where there's temples and forests and monkeys. What we found in a nutshell after many decades of research in Bali is that the macaque monkeys aren't just monkeys in a forest. They are monkeys related to living around temples, these religious structures that are built by Balinese people and used by Balinese people for Hindu ceremonies that are also related to the tourism industry, which is directly connected to the economy of Bali, to the broader Indonesian economy, and to the global economy. So it turns out the lives of these monkeys in Bali are connected not just to the local Balinese, but also to the broader Hindu religion, to the broader tourism industry in Bali, and to the global tourism industry in Indonesia and beyond. Plus, it turns out our work on their genetics and their health, the viruses and bacteria they carry, is also directly connected to when and where tourists are, when they come, and how the Balinese landscape system of rice agriculture and tourism has shaped the landscape. So the macaque monkeys are fully 100% part of the human landscape. We shape their world, and they also shape us a little bit. Let me jump across the planet from Southeast Asia to Southern Europe, to the territory of Gibraltar, which is here in southern Spain. Gibraltar is a territory of the UK, not Spain, even though Spain still claims it. And what we can see is that is at the very, here's Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, very southern tip. You can see the southern tip here is Gibraltar. This is Africa here. And the southern tip of Gibraltar is this large, basically granite outcrop of rock And on the top of this rock is a nature reserve. And surrounding this rock is a city, the city of Gibraltar, with approximately 42,000 humans and about 260 macaque monkeys. There are 6 groups of macaque monkeys, about 230 individuals a decade ago, now about 260, and they live in this, what's called the Upper Rock Nature Reserve. If you Google Rock of Gibraltar, you will see this incredible granite outcropping, and across that whole granite outcropping is some forest and a lot of monkeys. This is what the Upper Rock Nature Reserve looks like, but remember, it is surrounded by a city, right? So this is a forest or a jungle, much like your central catchment area, surrounded completely by city. And in that area are these macaques, the Barbary macaque, which, unlike the macaques you have, the long-term macaques, these macaques look extremely like teddy bears and are quite mellow and much larger. These macaques are about 4 times the size of your monkeys, and very large and really quite fascinating. But what's so interesting, just like in Bali, is that the relationships, the structures of relationships in these macaque monkeys are intricately tied to centuries of human manipulation of the environment. So the humans have changed the landscape, have built cities, have built forts and towers, and the monkeys have mapped to those human lives. And what's very interesting is that the relationship in our multiple years of study in Gibraltar, the relationship between humans and macaques influences these incredible waves of migratory birds, goats, cats, rats, seagulls, the reptiles, the plants, and the endemic Barbary partridge in this area. So the relationship between the humans and the monkeys cascades out and shapes the entire ecology of the Upper Rock Nature Reserve. So again, just like in Bali, there's this incredible dynamic relationship between monkeys and people, and that relationship has huge impacts economically, ecologically, and behaviorally. Okay, so the Bali situation is fascinating about religion and history and tourism. The Gibraltar situation is really fascinating about economics and tourism and history and ecology. So Singapore, you are sitting on a natural experiment, a small island that is one of the densest places on the planet for human habitation, one of the largest, most dynamic, and probably most modern city in the world, completely rife with tropical rainforest and incredible animal life. And so Singapore is, for much of the world, the place we look to understand how can humans, cities, and animals all coexist. So it turns out that Singapore is very interesting because Singapore has a variety of different kinds of interactions with monkeys. And we can talk about some of the other animals later. And everyone, your colleagues here at NParks, do an amazing job of monitoring, understanding, and ameliorating the conflicts with other animals. But humans and macaques have a very diverse array of interactions in Singapore. You have a very healthy macaque population. Your macaques in Singapore are some of the smallest of the long-tail macaques, but some of the healthiest. And that's very interesting. There's also, unlike many places, an existing management infrastructure. NParks, the National Parks Board of Singapore, has been for decades considering, researching, consulting with a diverse array of researchers to develop one of the most advanced and most forward-looking management strategies of anywhere on the planet. And I would argue you have probably the model that is best suited for the human-monkey interface in the world. And you will see how that turns out, but I'm very optimistic. So I think that Singapore is a model for us all. It's a place where we're all looking and seeing what happens over the next 10, 20 years so that maybe we can learn something and use this model that you are providing somewhere else. Okay, so human-macaque coexistence is fascinating in Singapore because most people, I mean, if you live in Singapore, it's not surprising at all, but most people will say, what do you expect to see in a giant mega city, the most modern city on the planet? You don't expect to see a bunch of animals, and yet there are all these macaques. So the questions us scientists have about this unexpected reality of amazing urban development, but incredible forest and incredible wildlife is, what are the relationships? What are the risks and costs of maintaining these relationships? What are the patterns of the interactions between people and monkeys? And how should the conflicts and the commensalisms, commensalism means living together. So how should the conflicts and the living together be managed? What is the best way to do this? Okay, so there's been ongoing studies of the populations in Singapore macaques for almost 20 years ongoing, but I actually learned many years ago that 50 years ago, there were already a few studies of the Singapore macaques and what used to be called the Singapore Botanical Gardens. There were groups of macaques and a few scientists went and looked at them. Now, what's fascinating about those early studies is they went only to the forests and the botanical gardens and into sort of what is today the central catchment to say, oh, well, here are the macaques, let's study them. When if you read the newspapers and you actually talk to anyone who lived around Singapore in this time period, there were macaques everywhere, right? They were moving all over the place. They were always there. But for the last 20 years, we've recognized that, and scientists inside and outside of Singapore have asked the question, well, what's going on? All right, well, what have we learned for 20 years plus of study of macaques in Singapore? That the population has varied, you know, from about 1,000 to 2,000. Now you have about a few thousand macaques in Singapore compared with almost 6 million humans. And so that's very important. Remember, there are many, 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 many more of us than there are of macaques. And yet the macaques draw our attention. Most of the macaques, but not all of them, are in what would be called the central catchment area. And the remaining population is in parks and forest fragments in and around urban development mostly, and a few of your offshore islands. Now, the in and around urban development is important because throughout the range across Southeast Asia, where this long-tail macaque, Macaca fascicularis, occurs, it always prefers not to live in deep forest. It prefers, all these monkeys want to live around humans. And that's really interesting. All right, so most of the population, if not all, overlaps with human and urban areas. At least 70% of the monkeys in Singapore know humans. They know how to read you, they know how to interact with you, they're used to you, what we call habituated. And about 50% of all the monkeys in Singapore actually obtain some of their food from you, right? Your garbage, from direct feeding, from a variety of other ways. Now, this is an old map, right? This is about 10 years old, but what it shows you is that, yes, the central catchment area is where a lot of monkeys are, but actually monkeys are found throughout. Sometimes in small groups, sometimes in large groups, but you live in Singapore, so you know that they're all over the place. And that's quite fascinating because that is sort of atypical. In very few places are there incredible dense urban landscapes with so many primates. Okay, so in Singapore then, you have this long-term management, this long-term relationship. What's going on? Well, there are, especially recently, and I'm sure some people on this talk have experienced this themselves, increasing level of complaints. There is a nuisance issue with monkeys. But what is that overall level of conflict? When I came to Singapore first about 20 years ago to actually ask about this conflict level, the complaints were high, and NParks and the government of Singapore was concerned about it. But for me, it was very funny because the actual level of conflict and complaints were so low compared to everywhere else on the planet. Everywhere else where people and monkeys overlapped, it was a much bigger problem. But you do have problems, and there are things. So the real question 20 years ago and today is, what are the actual conflicts? What are the challenges between humans and monkeys in Singapore? How can we understand them? How can we quantify them? And most importantly, how can we manage them so that we have the best and most sustainable outcomes for people and for monkeys? The second question comes from this fact that most macaque groups are habituated to humans, and that's good, but it's also a problem. They know us, they can read us, which makes them harder to manage because they know how to deal with our attempts to control them. And that's a challenge. The groups that interface most with humans, which is the majority of macaques in Singapore, they're more healthy. Those monkeys that live in and around and forage on our garbage and take food from us and climb around our fences and yards, they actually do better. Females have more infants, the overall group size is larger, and they eat more of our foods. And it turns out, just like for us, you know, our foods are good. They're high in nutrition, they're easy to process. The human trick of agriculture has been to create natural plants and modify them such that they are even better than ever you could find in the forest. And the monkeys are very smart. They know how to take advantage of that. Now, what's also very interesting is that we are the #1 reason why the populations of these monkeys are challenged. At least 3 to 5% of the deaths of monkeys are caused by automobiles. There's other human caused mortality, and then there's natural mortality. They do die at a certain percentage, but that's fairly low. This is why understanding these relationships is quite important. So the realities of monkeys living in urban environments is that they are in our homes. They're on our fences, they're in our kitchens. And while that is interesting, it is also problematic. And so the challenge for Singapore, unlike many of these other places where the human monkey overlap occurs, is that the challenge of living in an urban environment with monkeys is difficult. And it is difficult because of our urban landscape. We create these incredibly high dense foraging sites. Our garbage, our bins, our rubbish bins are incredibly rich places to eat, right? Our kitchens, the backyards when we have a little picnic, these are amazingly rich sites for monkeys who live, who know our styles, who know what we're doing, and can have access to that. So Singapore is our home. It's not my home now, it was before, but it's the home of humans, but it's also the home of monkeys. And the big challenge is, can we have a sustainable population? Can we live here? So I would just like to very briefly, to end up here, point out that I would suggest maybe we can. And I show you this picture as part of our research. This is me, obviously, and I'm holding here at this arrow a first generation drop-off GPS collar. This is one of the innovations we did about, let's see, about 8 years ago, where we perfected this really good tracking technology. And what we did is we had trapped certain monkeys, like this individual here, put these collars on them for 3, 4, 5 days, and then triggered them to drop off. So we could do minimal harm to the monkeys and yet find a lot about how they moved around. And I just want to point out that in 2014, when we did this monkey that we chose, his name was Ben, and actually named after Benjamin Lee, our co-host here in the NParks. And he was very good collaborator in our research project. So let me show you a little bit about what we found. And here I'm going to use 2 bits of data from these GPS. And the reason I want to do this is to show you how we ask questions about how do we understand sustainability and these relationships. This is Kurt, a young male from Bukit Timah, and this is a young female, Agustina. I didn't name her, but you know, that's the name they gave her, from Bukit Timah as well, 2 different groups. And what we did is put these collars on them, and then we tracked them for many, many, many days. And what we were able to find, and this is just a graph showing about a month's worth of their movement, is to understand how they navigated the environment. And this kind of research, understanding how these monkeys live in the city, in the forest, and how they move around is critically important. So let's take Kurt's example here, which I think is really telling. Here we have the sort of Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, and we see that Kurt spent an enormous amount of time in the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, moving around deep into the forest, but also spending a lot of time fully in human engagements, and really even crossing over this large road into these areas over here. And what's really important, if you break this down by day, so this is an example of, I think, 28 days with a different color for each day, you can see that in different days, they use different times. And so understanding these relationships is to understand that just like us, the monkeys have their patterns, they have their rituals. Sometimes those rituals and patterns bring them into conflict with us, right? Into these specific areas where we are. Other times they're very far away from us. And so understanding what drives those patterns and those relationships, that's going to help us humans understand how to predict and how to manage the different movements of the macaque monkeys. Okay, so this kind of overview, and I'd be glad to talk to you much more about that as we move forward in the Q&A, is really important, but we also have this opportunity to sort of digitally do more than just track them. In fact, what we did was something called a critter cam with National Geographic and NParks, where we were able to put on some cameras to different monkeys and actually to look through their eyes. And I just want to really quickly, just to take a moment, I would love to show you a couple videos here of some of this data. Let me show you really quickly a image from that individual that I just called Kurt a moment ago. I hope, can people see this? Give me a thumbs up, someone, if you can actually see this. Yes, okay. So here's Kurt's hand. He's wearing a HD camera that's really, it's gotten a little foggy or what have you. The color isn't that good. HD camera, you can see his paw here, his front hand. And I just want to show you a little bit about what we can see of their lives. Here he is actually in this, just over this overpass, which is about to jump onto, as you can see this overpass, crossing a very large road here. And this gives you this incredible image of the time, their movement around, but also their relationship to the human world. Here he is running across, and here he is checking out traffic, looking back. And what he does in this thing, and we were watching him, he sort of runs across this path and eventually goes, he's looking back here just to check, but he's eventually going to sort of run across this overpass that we built, right, that humans built. And he's going to use this overpass to get to a fruiting fig tree on the other side and to some estates that are there. And so this research, right, allows us to get an idea of what they do. So here is, oops, sorry, I gave the same one. Let me give you a slightly different one, and then I'll wrap this up a little bit. There we are. Okay. Here is another individual actually feeding this camera just to show us a little bit of what they're doing. And again, I just want to show you, this is just the camera. Again, I apologize, the quality of this isn't so good as our early things. This individual's eating leaves and stripping bark. And so this camera is hanging under his throat and we're seeing him just eating. And here you can actually see him chewing fruit. And I show you this to highlight that much of the food that these monkeys eat is in fact from the forest, and their interactions with other individuals in the forest is extremely important. And so through research, we get just brief understandings. Here he's watching someone jump. All right, I will stop sharing this. Through this research, we're able to actually not only track how they move across space in Singapore, but understand sort of what these different aspects of their life are and help us to see, not only to sort of watch them, right? This is a clip of the monkey wearing a camera, but to see what they see. And what was amazing about this research is that it enabled us to understand how the macaques move through the landscape. And what we saw is that they interact with the forest, they feed in the forest, there's plenty of food and social interactions, but they also always come back to the human landscape. So the question is then, what do we do as human beings overlapping with macaques, with these conflicts, with this potential to understand how they interact with us? And my suggestion is we manage, as we always do, with everything, with each other, with the landscape, with the ecologies. The monkeys are always going to be in your rearview mirror in Singapore. They're always around when you look, when you turn over your shoulder. And so figuring out how they use the landscape in Singapore, how the landscape is modified or created by humans, and what those relationships are is actually extremely important. So my punchline for all of this, and this was very quick, and I hope we can talk about some of these things in the Q&A, is basically that the macaque monkeys live with us humans, but we live with them too. And there's a way to do this successfully. And I would like to suggest, or leave you with at least the possibility that it is in Singapore that the world can learn how we can do this better. Thank you very much.
Wow, Agustín, thank you for that great sharing and also for taking us on a whirlwind tour of your research sites. I have not actually seen that footage. That must be a director's cut
Yeah.
from the critter camp. Yeah. So now it's time for our Q&A session. We're going to take a few questions. The first one is actually interesting. There's this one on the long-term macaque being endangered on the IUCN list. It says that in the assessment report, they mentioned that Singapore is the only national level agency program run by the government and wildlife agencies. And it's also stated that even here, there can be improvement in methods, ecological focus, and increased regularity of assessment. So the person wants to know how, what we have done so far and what else can we do.
I mean, well, Ben, you can speak to this very well. Let me just say that, as you can tell from my presentation already, I remain in awe of an NParks because Singapore is uniquely positioned, right? Because of its small size and its extensive investment in national ecological assessment and management to do work that other places have not done, right? And so what you see from the outside looking into Singapore, yes, there are problems, but you have a sort of leg up in the sense that you have an infrastructure to do this research. You're actively inviting scholars from outside and inside of Singapore to talk about this and to do this analysis. And so what I think is really interesting is that you have had a management plan for many years and you've pivoted. You've actually changed that plan over the last 15 years to address new instances, to sort of deal with new challenges. And I would argue that even though everything doesn't work perfectly, you are in a position to understand more dynamically what these relationships are. And so the IUCN red listing assessment of long-tail macaques has placed them in the endangered category. And that means that research on them and understanding their management is absolutely critical. This is a scientific priority. And you are leading the way for us to sort of think about how we can do this management, how we can do this monitoring, and how maybe we can achieve some kind of sustainability. Because if we can't make it work in Singapore, then it's not going to work anywhere.
Yeah, so so let me talk about some of the things that the Wildlife Management Division is doing to manage the macaque population, which actually includes science-based population management, and that includes a census maybe every few years to look at how the macaque populations are faring. We also look into habitat modification and carrying out the studies to understand population ecology and also managing the movement of the macaques. We are looking at the health of the monkeys as well, looking into their metabiome as well as what they eat through genetic studies. I mean, it actually sheds so much light by using a genetic approach in understanding a full range of the foods that they eat, so that we can plan for the monkeys and perhaps put back some of these trees in the forest in greater numbers, so that they're supported by the food in forests. Because very often people ask, is there anything? Is there enough food in the forest for the monkeys? And as you have shown, from the critter camp footage, I think they spend a lot of time foraging in the forest itself, and there is actually sufficient food, and there's actually no need for human provisioning. So yeah, but managing the macaque population is not just the responsibility of the government or agencies, but we would like to invite the community to play a role in ensuring that the macaque encounters are safe for all by appreciating them from a safe distance, respectfully, do not feed them, keep your food out of sight, and lastly, implement monkey-proof measures if you're staying next to the nature areas.
And I think, Ben, let me follow up. I think that's so important, because the only management plan that will ever work is a management plan that involves everyone, right? The population and everyone. And what you said about respectful encounters, there are a few questions in the queue here that ask about the behaviors, right? So one thing is no one should be afraid of long-tail macaques because they really are more afraid of us than we are of them. However, there's a few ways that you already know as a primate, right? Everyone watching this, humans are primates. We know how to read macaque behavior. So when a macaque shows you their teeth, you know what that means. That means don't approach that monkey, move away, back up. If a monkey is making a bark at you or sort of lunging at you, just move away, you know, let that go. We know how to read the signs, so we know how to sort of create peaceful encounters. I think one of the most important things is when monkeys are around, don't give them direct attention, don't feed them, make sure your rubbish bins are as monkey proof as possible, and enjoy the coexistence, but don't invite them for conflict or food. And I think if people participate in that relationship, I think it's much more beneficial. Think of the monkeys like a beautiful bird, right? You don't hopefully want to run out and grab a bird when you see it. You just sort of look at it and enjoy it. And I think that's the same way we need to think about the macaque monkeys.
Yeah, so that takes care of this question where somebody asked about, you know, monkeys bearing their teeth and what should they do. So thanks a lot for that, Agustín. And our next question is, how has the population management and control, like sterilization, relocation of the macaques in Gibraltar impacted the human-macaque conflict situation?
So I think there's something that's really important is one of the things we're seeing both out of Gibraltar and Hong Kong is that there is an important population control, or what we would call family planning control of monkeys. So one of the challenges to keep populations of monkeys a size that flourishes in this relationship with humans in these urban environments. And one way to do that is to keep them very healthy with food and sort of with range and forest, but also then to control the reproductive status, to control the level of increase of a population. And today, the modes of sterilization, which sounds horrible, but the modes of controlling how many individual monkeys are fertile or possibly fertile within a population is actually quite safe, quite humane, and quite stable. And so it's become a very, I think, important thing. And so Hong Kong and Gibraltar have had success in capturing, safely treating, and releasing a cluster of the population, but modifying their natural fertility. So a little bit of control of reproduction with fewer infants born, smaller growth in the population, and you have a much more stable relationship because that numbers game is the real challenge. The more monkeys you have, right, after a certain level, the bigger the problems are. So you find what's the right level, and then you maintain that in the population through health assessment, through sterilization, and through just monitoring the population. And that's proved very successful in Hong Kong and Gibraltar. And I think that's a good model potentially for the future of Singapore as well.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks, Agustín. Yeah, and I have a question about someone noticing a monkey foaming at the mouth. Is the monkey okay? I can take that question. I've actually consulted our wildlife vets, and there can be many causes for a macaque to kind of foam at the mouth. Could be dental or oral issues, gastrointestinal disease, viral and bacterial infections such as rabies. And all these can result in excessive salivation. So my advice is actually if a macaque is observed to be ill or injured, please keep a safe distance, and you can inform NParks for further assistance at 1-800-476-1600. That is our animal helpline. Yep.
I think that's great recommendation, Ben. If you have any issue, if you think a monkey's sick in any way, please call that number. Please inform and just keep away from the monkey. Don't approach them. But another thing that's very important to point out is that throughout the year in different places of Singapore, you'll have fruiting trees in the forest and in people's gardens. And what you will know is that not just monkeys, but other mammals around fruiting trees, when they get access to ripe mangoes or things like that, will also salivate, drool, and foam at the mouth just because they enjoy the ripe fruit so much. So if you think there's a problem, please call the animal control and NParks, but just don't approach. That's the best thing. In most cases, it's not a problem. Just keep your distance, be respectful, and you know, go ahead with your day. I think that's really the important way to interact with monkeys.
Okay. I've got a question related to the pandemic, right? So there are lesser visitors to macaque attractions, led to less food provisioning. You know, and if so, were there still conflicts, and you know, how were they managed? Did you get any reports from Bali or Gibraltar?
Yeah, so around Southeast Asia and in North Africa and Gibraltar, right, with COVID, the horrors of the pandemic reduced travel, reduced tourism, and reduced tourist provisioning. However, it did not necessarily reduce the infrastructure or the management by local communities. And so what we found very interestingly is that many local communities continued with their provisioning and management strategies, which actually worked very well. It turns out that tourist provisioning and sort of provisioning outside of a management strategy is what causes much of the problems. So in a few places, like in Bali, for example, the management committees realized very quickly that to increase their provisioning, because otherwise the monkeys were going into the hotels and restaurants to find the food, because they were used to getting food from tourists. And so here's one of the things that I think Singapore can learn from. When you see throughout Singapore these signs saying do not feed the monkeys, pay attention. It actually, by not feeding the monkeys, by making the monkeys feed in the forest or only forage on non-provisioned items, you are actually training them to just live in harmony as opposed to trying to get something from you. And so I think what we've learned from the pandemic is that all of these populations are fine. They can find food in most cases, especially in Singapore. They are not hungry. There is sufficient food. The problem is human foods are especially attractive. And so the COVID pandemic offered us a window into seeing that actually all of these populations are fine without tourist provisioning. So maybe as we move past the pandemic, hopefully, we really double down on not offering food to monkeys. They are okay, and it's going to make our lives and our relationships better if we do not offer food. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah. Yeah, so I know you've mentioned some of the ways from other countries. So what are some of the effective ways and models from other countries in this sort of human wildlife or conflict mitigation? I guess maybe not just from macaques, but even taking a leaf from how they manage other animals.
So I think one of the most important things, and this was the video that you showed before this talk, was very, very important. That it's a wonderful video from NParks. I think I would show that all the time, and I hope people hit the link in YouTube and share that, because it's very important to show that one of the most important mitigation of conflict models is understanding where and when the other species are. So camera traps, monitoring of a variety of ways. So once you understand where the boars or the monkeys or the birds or the reptiles are moving in the landscape, you get a much better idea of where the management needs to happen, right? Where it is. So the science is very important in that. The second thing is this idea of actually having a cadre, a group of individuals that are humans that are actively monitoring and interceding in conflicts, that are there to help the public with conflicts between monkeys and humans, or wild pigs and humans, or what have you. So having someone like NParks, right, their wildlife group, to be able to do this, that's incredibly beneficial. And that's been central in many other countries to the success of a human wildlife conflict amelioration or management. And the final thing is the public themselves. The public has to have, as you've noted many times, and NParks does a great job of presenting this, respect and care for the other animals in their environment. And this means avoiding conflict situations. We humans, we're running the show. basically. We build the cities, we have the food, we have the rubbish bins. We are the ones that are sort of driving whether a conflict happens or not. And so much of that conflict management is based on our behavior. And so humans can actively reduce conflicts very, very successfully. So I would say that the three things are good science to monitor where and when conflicts happen, intervention by trained individuals that intervene between the animals and humans in these conflicts, and finally the public themselves doing the ethical and respectful thing and reducing conflict.
Yeah, so Augustine, I'd like to add to that because we have also got trained people that manage some of these conflicts through a process called monkey guarding that kind of keeps monkeys at a distance from, say, the premises or the residence of people's houses without actually harming them. Their mere presence to deter monkeys from entering the premises. But I also gave some thought about, how nice it would be if we continue this critter cam experiment, because I would like to see, how a certain interaction arises from the monkey's point of view. And through numerous, this is kind of a science-based behavioral approach where we could actually get a lot of insights into, what people say, how a situation started, as opposed to the monkey's point of view. I mean, the animals are silent and, they haven't got any anything to support them. Very often, if some of these conflicts are really perceived, or are they really serious, that sort of thing. Yeah.
So this is very interesting. My former student, now professor, Jeffrey Peterson in Bali, did this incredible series of video analysis of the monkeys who would follow people and take their goodies, take their glasses or other valuables or water things, and exchange them, right? With the local Indonesian, the local Balinese men, exchange them for peanuts or for other goods in this incredible study. But what was fascinating from what you're saying is that you could tell there were patterns. These monkeys would target only certain people, only certain contexts. And so understanding scientifically sort of what is it about us that certain monkeys say, oh, I'm not going to bother this person. Oh, but this person I'm going to steal something from. I mean, that's sort of the next phase of management, right? To understand how they see us. And I think that's very important. And I'll tell you right now, if you're wandering around monkeys, carrying a big plastic bag with food in it and making a lot of noise with that plastic bag, bad idea. They know where the food is. And so just we, the public, can be aware of how we're holding food or water bottles or, fruits or what have you. And if we're going to be around monkeys, we can just sort of think beforehand and be a little bit more careful by putting things in our backpacks and zipping it up, or by not carrying plastic bags in front of monkeys. There's all of this kind of relationship building that we can do ahead of time, because again, we're in control, right? The humans are ones driving this system. There's ways we can learn from studying what the monkeys pick up on us about how to ameliorate or reduce these conflicts.
Augustine, I think you preempted the next question I was going to ask, and you have already provided the answer, which is the question was how to handle monkeys that steal people's valuables, and yeah, you have kind of said it all,
Well, and the thing is, do not. And one thing people want to do is chase after the monkey or throw rocks at them or chase them. The best way, if a monkey takes something from you, the best way to get it back is to ignore the monkey completely. Because they want you to either get upset or to throw something at them or to give them something. If you ignore them completely, I guarantee you in most cases, they'll just drop whatever they have, because if they stole the papaya from you or a mango or an apple, they're just gonna take it and eat it, it's gone. But if they stole something else from you, they don't want it. They're gonna eventually drop it if you ignore them.
Well, Augustine, thank you for that final piece of advice. And with that, we're going to close, this webinar session. And I'd like to again thank you for your generous time and sharing, and for staying up so late. sorry about that. But the
No
good thing is that,
worries. It's
it's Saturday tomorrow for you.
yeah. It's not quite tomorrow, so I haven't
Yeah.
time traveled into Saturday yet, but you're already there. So how is it? Is Saturday morning good? It looks nice.
Yeah, it is good. Very good here in the Botanic Gardens. And I also like to give a big thank you to our audience on Zoom for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again. In the next seminar. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks for everyone attending this session as well, and we wish you a great day ahead. All right, bye.